Hi, everyone, and welcome to this conversation that I am having with Lindsey Paris-Lopez. My name is Adam Ericksen, and this is Lindsey. Hi, Lindsey. How are you today?
Hi, I'm great. Thanks. How are you, Adam?
I'm doing just fine. Lindsey and I are going to have a conversation about Islam. Islam is in the news a lot these days, and Lindsey and I thought with Islam. And Lindsey and I are both blogging at the Raven Foundation. Lindsey is my friend and colleague there. Lindsey is also very important to have this conversation with you because Lindsey went to Hartford Seminary to study Christian-Muslim relationships. And so, Lindsey, I greatly value our friendship and also the relationships and friendships that you have with Muslims. And I was wondering if you could start off this conversation by talking about your history with Islam.
Okay. Well, my history with Islam goes pretty far back. I was born into a Christian family with a very strong Christian mother, but an atheist father, and that combination produced a love for the church in me, but also a lot of doubt and some fear and anxiety. My own church was wonderful, but our culture sends a message of doom and gloom for people who don't believe in Jesus, and so I grew up not knowing exactly what to believe, wanting to love God, but being more afraid than loving sometimes because I was concerned for my father, and also because I can't say that my faith really came naturally to me because, one of the most intelligent people I knew, every little girl hero is her daddy, or should be that way. And I loved my daddy. He was smart, and if he couldn't believe in God, how could I? So that's an issue that I grew up struggling with. And my Muslim friends, I met my first Muslim friend when I was in the 6th grade, and she was the sweetest person in the world. I had gotten a new perm the summer before I started 6th grade, and everybody made fun of it, even though I think it was really pretty. And she let me sit by her on the bus and didn't judge my hair, and that's how our friendship started. So she was the first person to reach out to me with kindness. I was shy, mouthy, introverted. She was the first person I could really open up to in all of my school years, really, and she was Muslim.
How
and
sweet.
as I got to know her better, I learned, I saw in her the kind of faith that I wanted. I mean, growing up in love with the church and being sort of afraid of God, but not wanting to be afraid of God, I wanted to have the peaceful, calm, strong faith that I saw in her. And as we grew older, we talked more and more about our faith. And, I talked to her about Christianity, and I tried to learn as much about Christianity as I could. And she talked to me about Islam, but the differences didn't matter so much to me. The big difference for me was whether or not you believe in God. Any differences between Islam and Christianity were relatively minor to me, and I just grew up seeing Shema, that's her name, and her family having such strong faith. And as we started talking about it more, I also realized it makes a lot more sense in Christianity. I mean, one of the things that really two things that really bothered me about Christianity were the atonement, because I couldn't understand how a horrible, brutal death could, get us into heaven. And I thought, how bad must I be if that's what Jesus had to do for me? How bad must we all be? Are we really that horrible that it takes somebody dying and rising from the dead, however that works, to get us into heaven? So that always bothered me. And then, of course, it was hard for me to wrap my mind intellectually around the Trinity, so I didn't know how to understand that Jesus is God, but not really, but yes, really, and, you know.
Yeah.
And that was very confusing to me. Jesus died, but God rose him from the dead, but so they're different, but they're the same.
But isn't Jesus God? And so how does God rise God from the dead? It's, complicated.
Yeah. Very, very complicated stuff. I've tried explaining it to my 5-year-old, and she describes it as poopy. So,
poopy theology, Mom. That's poopy.
Well, I don't expect her to get it now, but I didn't get it at 16. At 16, I did not get those things, and they were real stumbling blocks to my faith. But I wanted a strong faith so badly, and I wanted so badly to believe in a God who was loving and kind. And my friend Shema did. And the more we talked about our faith, the more I wanted the certainty that she had. And I thought if I could just leave the crucifixion and the Trinity behind, I could have a solid faith in a loving creator God that I thought my friend Shema had. And so I converted to Islam when I was 16. And I mean, at the time, I studied it, I prayed about it, I thought about it. It seemed like more than just a good decision. You know, I felt compelled in my heart to do what I thought was right, and that's why I converted. But it's hard to explain that story in 5 minutes, and really, you know, it's hard to really get into all of that so quickly. If I'm making it sound like I just chose to try to forget about the hard parts of Christianity and just chose to become a Muslim, that's not really how it felt at the time. It's just the easiest way to explain it in a few minutes. And so,
sure, no, I think that you've explained it really well. You were looking for something that was love, and you found it in your friend Shema, who modeled it for you back in the bus, and she was also showing it to you through her faith and her family's faith in Islam. So I think that makes a lot of sense. The story that you tell makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and also I should mention that some of the images that we have of Islam in the media were so foreign to what I saw in Shema and her family. I mean, the news wasn't as big as it is now about Islam, but Muslims still had a kind of a scary reputation and certainly a foreign reputation. At the time, my friend didn't wear hijab, but she did dress modestly. And it was a house full of women. Her mother was divorced, and she was living with her mother, her grandmother, and her 3 sisters. So, and her great-grandmother. So let's see, that's 3 adults and 4. So it was a family of 7 very strong women, 7 very strong, very smart women. And that was the Islam that I was introduced to. So, you know, it was really after I converted that, I wasn't naive. I converted by the time I was 16, so I heard rumors about Islam, and I certainly read a lot of horrible stuff about Islam on the internet by then. But my first impression of Muslims was strong, faithful, loving, and the most intelligent people. I mean, Shema graduated in the top 5 of our class, and she probably could have been valedictorian, but her freshman year, she only started in the middle of her freshman year, and I think that's probably the only reason that she wasn't at the very top of the top. I mean, everything just pointed to Muslims being strong, compassionate, intelligent people for me. So.
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah.
So then, what happened? I mean, you're not a Muslim now. What happened?
No. Well, I mean, first of all, Christianity was deeper in me and in my culture and in my upbringing than I knew to give it credit for at the time. I mean, I probably would not have looked at Christianity again if it wasn't. So the way I grew up and was raised in the church, aside from my father, I come from a family of church folk. I mean, both of my grandfathers are ministers, or were ministers, and my mother and grandmother were elders in the Presbyterian church. So, and I wanted to fit in with them, and I wanted to impress them, and I learned theology, and I was still interested in learning theology, even Christian theology, after I became a Muslim. Also, it's hard to keep up with the daily practices of Islam when you're not surrounded by Muslims. So when I went to college, I fell out of the 5 daily prayers, felt very guilty about it for a long time, but I prayed, but it was only occasionally that I would actually bow down, and which is sad because I really did enjoy it with my Muslim friends, and I enjoyed it. I even enjoyed it alone, but after a while, I just fell out of practice. I took a course on Islam, which I probably shouldn't have done so soon. I was shocked and dismayed by all of the violence in early Islamic history. Of course, I'm also shocked and dismayed by all of the violence in Christian history too. But at the time, it just kind of shattered my ideal.
Wow.
And there are other reasons why I not only fell out of practice, but really, not only fell out of practice, but really started to question and doubt and feel like maybe I had jumped too soon at being a Muslim. None of it changed how I felt about my friends or what I had learned from them. But a few things. One, at my college, there were a lot of lesbians, and I loved them. I was best friends with a couple of them. And at the very beginning, I tried to treat them as I would treat men, so I would never allow them into my room without the door shut, and I would never, without the door open, I would never allow myself to be alone with one of them. And we started talking, and one day, one of my best friends said, if I'm going to meet a lot of homophobic people, I hope they're all like you. And I didn't know how to respond to that.
Yeah.
Horrible.
Wow. Yeah.
And she genuinely meant it as a compliment, but I felt awful, and I couldn't, so questions about Islam's relationship to the homosexual community, Islam's relationship to violence came up in my mind, And as I was going through all these questions, I also started attending chapel regularly. That didn't make me a Christian, but it did put a lot of thought in my head for later. I went to chapel because my chaplain was a missionary kid who had grown up in Islamic countries, and I could talk to her about all of my questions and all of my doubts. So it was really lucky, and she never tried to convert me, but her influence was lasting, and eventually I could see the cross and the Trinity in a new way, and it was partly because I wasn't so afraid of going to hell if I didn't believe them, and that was a gift that Islam gave me. So I started looking at them as metaphor, looking at the idea of someone taking our sins upon himself and bearing them and being left with nothing but love. I saw the crucifixion that way. And I came up with the theory of the covalent love bond to describe the Trinity. And eventually metaphor wasn't enough, and I thought, no, I really believe this. And one day at church, I was going back to church, and one day it was Confirmation Sunday, and I just whispered what the confirmands were whispering, or were saying loudly. I just whispered it under my breath. I considered that my official return to the Christian faith.
Wow.
And when that happened, I was terrified of telling my Muslim friends for a long time. And when I finally did, there was some sadness, but it wasn't really anything that they didn't know by then. And they blessed me with their love. And that's when I knew just how unconditional that love was. And I think my friends and I are even stronger now. I mean, we haven't seen each other in years, but we're more mature, and time hasn't changed our love for each other. So I know that about Muslims, and that makes me love them even more. And so that's why I feel called, sometimes conflicted, but called to interfaith dialogue and understanding.
It is such a beautiful story, and it flies in the face of all of the stereotypes that we hear about Muslims who leave the faith, as opposed to blessing them with love. The stereotype is, no, we're supposed to distance from Muslims from your childhood up until now.
Yeah. My experience has definitely not been, they didn't try to stone me.
Right.
And new Muslims, or when I meet Muslims who've been Muslims their whole life, but when I make a new friendship with a Muslim, it takes a while for me to tell my story, but eventually I do tell my story, and I've never been met with anything but interest and acceptance, and some, I wouldn't say gratitude like I'm doing anyone any favors, but the Muslims I meet are generally appreciative of the fact that I took so much time to learn so much about Islam, and that,
Yeah.
So that's,
it's a great thing. And then you took this interest to Hartford Seminary to study Christian-Muslim relations. What did you learn there?
I learned that there are a lot of Muslims interested in Christian-Muslim dialogue. and I learned some basic. I wouldn't call it basics. I learned about. I took courses in reading the Bible and the Quran together, and I took courses in. I took a course in Islamic law. I took a course in the life of the Prophet Muhammad up through the Crusades. So I learned a lot of information that I've forgotten, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Also, the Muslims I met there are wonderful, wonderful people. But one of the things about Hartford Seminary is that they reserve their housing to international students, which makes sense because they're a small seminary, and if you come from another country, you need a place to live. But I didn't have an on-campus experience, so I wish that I could have gotten to know them better. But, they knew I was non-Muslim, and a lot of them knew my backstory, and I was still welcome to pray with them when I wanted to. So they were very, very nice and very respectful. And their faith made them want to learn more about their own faith and Christianity. So it wasn't like they were watered down or diluted Muslims. They were strong in their faith, and that's what gave them the strength to want to open up to Christians.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah. So
great thing.
Yeah. So, would you like to tell a little bit about your backstory, or
Sure. I became interested in Islam on 9/11. I was a senior in college at the time, and I just remember asking questions like, how could people do such a horrific act? They're just basic questions that everyone's asking. And what does Islam have to do with, what, if anything, does Islam have to do with this? So I started reading various books on Islam, and, every search has a question. And my question was, man, there has to be a much more positive, benevolent face to Islam than what happened on 9/11, and I'm going to go look for that. And that's what I found. I went to, my wife and I actually, after graduating college, went into the Peace Corps, and we went to Bangladesh, which is a Muslim country kind of on the east side of India, by the Indian Ocean. And I was really excited to learn about Islam while we were in the Peace Corps. And we were there, and the host family that was running the Peace Corps operation there said, give us your best couple, because we want to be with them for the next 2 years, and we want to learn American culture from them and teach them Bangladeshi culture. And we were chosen. My wife and I were chosen for that. It was such a culture shock being there. And that's neither a positive nor a negative assessment of the culture. It was just very intense and different, and we just couldn't handle it together as a couple. So I went to the family, to the dad, and said, I'm sorry, we have to leave. And we were all really sad. They had a son who was looking forward to having their uncle and their aunt from the United States stay with them for 2 years. So it was just it was heartbreaking. But I can tell you this, I was scared to tell them because they had all of these great expectations. But there was no resentment. There was just compassion. There was no, what, you don't like our home or our culture? There was none of that. It was just like acceptance, like what you're talking about. And, at the end, I said, well, I can call a taxi and have them come and get us. And the dad said, no, I am going to take you. You are my brother, and it is my duty to take my brother to the airport. And that just softened my heart because here I was expecting like resentment or some anger or something, and it was just this total acceptance of meeting me and my wife where we were and being us, and it was beautiful. Like I get chills just thinking about it right now. So that after that, I went on to seminary, and I wrote my master's thesis on love and nonviolence in Christianity and Islam. And I found this Muslim man, Abdul Ghaffar Khan, who was a friend of Gandhi's, and Abdul Ghaffar Khan changed his culture from one of tribal violence back and forth and revenge to one of like one tribe of nonviolence, and meeting the British and fighting the British nonviolently like Gandhi did. And he's really the untold story of India's independence from Britain that none of us have heard of. And here he is saying, I am doing this because I am a Muslim. It is my Muslim faith that is leading me to be nonviolent and try to love the British, their enemies, from his Muslim faith. And that we in the West need to listen to. I mean, there are so many voices that are speaking out against terrorism done in the name of Islam, and we are just not listening to it. We don't want to hear it. Western media is just giving us this trope of Islamic terrorism as if Islam and terrorism go together, and that is one of the biggest lies that we in the West are telling, and we need to stop telling it.
I agree. It's definitely a lie.
So that's where I'm at with that's where my history is with Islam. And should we take some of the questions that have been given to us now?
Yeah, because I think there's such great questions, and a lot of what I was planning to talk about could be formatted as answers to some of these questions. So yeah, let's
perfect. Well, I've got the first question. Let's take it from our friend Shema. Shema asks, one question I have is, what do you two view as the most important commonality and the most important difference between Christianity and Islam? Let's go with that one. She has a follow-up question. So, Lindsey, what do you view as the most important commonality and the most important difference between Christianity and Islam?
Okay, well, for me, the most important commonality is the character of God. And, we focus on, we like to say that Islam and Christianity are both monotheistic, and I think focusing on the number of gods is where a lot of people stop, but I think that's, the one single God that we worship. Because, I find that God revealed in Jesus, and Muslims don't, although Muslims revere Jesus. But for me, that God is loving, compassionate, merciful, and stands with, offers love to all, but particularly to those who are suffering in some way, particularly to the marginalized, particularly to the poor, particularly to the hungry, particularly to those who have not been favored in their lives, in their societies. We see that, I think, primarily in Jesus, in Christian scripture, although not exclusively in Jesus, but primarily and most fully in Jesus. But in the Quran and in Islam, it says over and over that God is with the poor, the widow, the orphan. I think it has widow and orphan together in a lot of verses of the Quran, in any ancient society. And the Quran commands care for them. And I think we all too soon forget just what a big deal that is. It seems natural now. Of course we should care about them. But I think it seems natural because of the influence that these faiths have had on us for over 1,000 years now. So.
Yeah, and it feels natural to some of us, but others will make excuses that the early opposition, the Quraysh, also made to Muhammad when Muhammad said, "You need to care for the poor, the weak, and the marginalized." The Quraysh would make statements like, "Listen, we've worked really hard for our money, and we should be able to keep it. And if we give money to people who aren't working hard for it, then they're not going to work hard. They need to pull themselves up by their bootstraps." And Muhammad would have none of it. He would say, "No, it doesn't matter. What matters is that you care for the Prophet today," much like Jesus says. Deuteronomy says, "Give to anyone who is needy among you." The Quran says, "Give to anyone who is needy among you." And I think you're exactly right to look to those kinds of justice passages to answer Shaman's question of what do we have in common with one another. And man, if Christians and Muslims got together to enact this justice that we all see that God wants for the world, man, the world would be a better place. A lot of our problems would not exist if we lived this out. If we lived this biblical and Quranic principle out, the world would be such a better place.
Yes, definitely. And of course we have our modern examples of those who say, "Well, I worked hard for my money. Why should I share it?"
Yeah.
I don't even think we need to get into that. It's just it would take us down a rabbit trail that we don't need to go there, but it's just too obvious, and all of our listeners know how obvious it is. So,
Yep. So what do you think, what's a difference? What's an important difference between Christianity and Islam?
I've thought of a few. Theologically, I think Jesus is a big difference, but he's also a commonality, and I don't want to understate the commonality. I mean, Muslims do believe that Jesus was a holy prophet, and my Muslim friends have told me that they think that the Quran testifies to his perfection being higher than that of Muhammad. I don't know if they were saying it to me because I was Christian at the time and they wanted to give me something. I honestly don't think so, though. There are stories in Islam about Muhammad's mistakes, and I haven't heard any stories in Islam about Jesus' mistakes. So Muslims do believe in Jesus, but of course the distinction I think is pretty important. But two things that I think are just as important and definitely worth talking about are, first of all, the Quran does justify violence, and a lot of people would say so does the Bible, but my understanding of the Bible does not justify violence. That would be too hard to unpack, but it goes with my second thought, which is I think that the Quran and the Bible in some ways are very different books, and show my understanding of biblical versus Quranic revelation is very different, and that's part of a struggle for me as I think about the Christian-Muslim dialogue.
Yeah, there's a whole lot there to unpack Yeah, that you and I both know we can't do in the next 5 minutes of our chat.
No.
But I would point out that there are Muslims who look to the Quran not as, and don't use it as a way to justify violence, and look at the Quran and see it actually as laying a claim of nonviolence upon them. They'll look to, like this Abdul Ghaffar Khan said, it should not be a surprise to anyone that a Muslim like me would choose nonviolence because it's what Muhammad chose to do while he was in Mecca. He looked at this specific strand and said, I am going to live this strand out. There's a book that I used for my thesis called, I think it's called Islam and Nonviolence. It's by a professor in South Florida State University. And he takes a look at Islam and nonviolence and the history of it. It's a fascinating book. So there are Muslims who are looking to their faith and interpreting it through a nonviolence lens, which they take to be authentic to Islam. So that is an exciting stream.
Absolutely.
But we just looked into Seamus' first question, and we have just a few minutes left. What do you think are the main reasons that people from both faiths may feel threatened by the other faith? I'll take this one first. I think that what we feel most threatened by is our similarities, not so much our differences. And mimetic theory really speaks to this. I think that we see ourselves so close together. There's something about being in the Abrahamic faith that is really exciting, that brings us together, but it's also really dangerous when you see yourselves as kind of brother or sister religions, because you can start competing for the same thing. So you can start competing for which religion is the best, or which religion has the most converts to it, or the most people in it throughout the world. I mean, you don't see Christians fighting with Hindus so much.
Right.
You don't see that kind of conflict. What you see is the conflict of the religions that are so closely related, coming into conflict more and more with one another. And of course, the opposite is true too. I mean, you and I have both told beautiful stories about Christians and Muslims who are coming together in commonality. But I think that we feel most threatened by what we see as similar as opposed to what we see as different.
I think that's absolutely true. I've often thought, I'm interested in Christian-Muslim relations in particular because of my history. But when I think about why I choose to study religions that are so similar, I think it's because, I do think that we feel threatened by our similarities, and so I feel a need for bridging gaps that are actually kind of small, because I don't see, and there's this feeling that when people are so close together, they either want to bring someone fully to their side, or they want to differentiate themselves and exaggerate the differences. Either one. But it feels a little uncomfortable to be so close and not exactly the same. And I think mimetic theory has helped me understand the reasons behind that more. And I just want to get back to Seamus' first question, because I think you're absolutely right that the Quran also promotes nonviolence. It absolutely promotes restraint, and it absolutely promotes forgiveness and mercy. And, violence in terms of self-defense only. And if I had to explain why I don't think the Bible allows for self-defense, because I don't, a lot of people would take that as, well, it's the Bible that has no mercy. Why can't people defend themselves? The Quran is more merciful than the Bible because it's letting people, not be killed by taking up arms to defend themselves. So these are very, very serious questions. And I think that for both the followers of the Bible and followers of the Quran, you have people on all sides of, on a long, completely not justifying them, would argue from a merciful perspective, would argue that I am refusing to take up arms, or I feel compelled to take up arms. They would all argue that it's for the sake of mercy. So I want to make that clear, and I want to respect that,
Yeah, definitely. It's a good. I'm going to combine two questions because they're both very similar. They're about Jesus. First, from Kari, how do Muslims view Jesus and the resurrection story? The second is from Lisa Hadler, who says, I often get frustrated with those who want to equate Muhammad and Jesus, given that Muhammad engaged in obviously mimetic behavior, like the messianic figure like Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
So how do Muslims view Jesus and the resurrection? I guess let's start with that.
Okay, that's an interesting question because in the Quran, there's a passage where the Muslims are meant to say to those who boast, we killed Jesus, son of Mary. Say to those who boast that they did not kill him nor crucify him, but it was made to appear as such. And most Muslims I know have taken that verse to mean Jesus was not crucified. He was saved. But then it gets complicated because, you have to be dead to be resurrected. So most Muslims don't believe in the resurrection, but most of them do believe in the bodily ascension of Jesus to heaven. So it's a confusing issue, but I think we have to look at the issue behind the issue, which is why wouldn't Muslims accept the crucifixion of Jesus as just a fact? And for most Muslims, it's because they say God is merciful, God is loving. Why would God do this to someone who led such a wonderful life and obeyed him so much? And if we can focus on that question, then we can find commonalities, even on the issue where we seem to be most farthest apart. So, most Muslims I know would say God is too merciful to allow such a brutal death. And then we can start talking about, why Jesus died and, why we think Jesus died. And I think we could find that we have a lot more in common there, even if we never agree on the question of whether or not he died. Interestingly, Muslims also believe that Jesus is coming back. Muslims actually believe in the second coming of Jesus, not Muhammad. Muhammad led his life, died, will be with God forever, and it's Jesus who is coming back according to Islam. So it's very interesting to study Islamic eschatology.
Jesus.
Do you have anything to add?
Yeah, Jesus is coming back for the general resurrection. So Muslims do believe in resurrection, just not the resurrection of Jesus that happened
again, we have to look at the reasons why they would. I mean, the reason is because the Quran says so, but the reason behind that reason, the reason it makes sense within the frame of the Quran and within their religion is because they don't believe that God could be that heartless. So it's because of a merciful God that they deny the crucifixion, whereas it's because of God's mercy that we believe that Jesus submitted to the crucifixion. And it's also interesting to me anyway that the Quran says, "Say to those who boast, you did not kill him nor crucify him." And the Bible says, "No one takes my life from me." So if you want to see it as Jesus' own decision and not human power over Jesus, then you could find a congruence in the scriptures. But most Muslims I know of don't see it that way. But that is a starting point for conversation anyway.
Wow, that's great. Now to Lisa's question, what's the difference between Jesus and Muhammad?
Yeah, there are differences between Jesus and Muhammad, and this is where the question of, I think, because I know Lisa is one of our friends from Theology and Peace, and she said that she discussed this issue with you before, Adam. Our major issue is violence, and Muslims did use defensive violence. Muhammad did use defensive violence. He did lead armies. So, and that's something that I have trouble with. Jesus, according to scriptures, never used violence against a person. He overturned tables in a temple, but someone might have gotten hit by flying merchandise, but he did not deliberately go and hurt anyone. He drove animals out with a cord, but those animals were going to be killed. So Jesus saved the lives of all those animals he drove out. Jesus submitted himself to be a victim of our violence. And Muhammad, at a time when the Muslim community was under threat, took up arms to defend the fledgling and vulnerable Muslim community. So that's the major difference. Of course, the Muslims who revere Muhammad see this as a mercy, see this as, God's protection, and that's important. And we have to really contend with the fact that, the Bible also talks about God protecting through violence. I mean, drowning a bunch of Egyptian soldiers is not nonviolent. So we have to look at how we understand the biblical passages. Also, yes, Muslims have the Quran justifies violence and self-defense. What's interesting to me about mimetic behavior, as far as Muhammad was concerned, was that he didn't denounce violence completely, and there is a place in Islam for defensive violence. But there are lots of stories about the Prophet Muhammad refusing violence when he became angry. I think there are stories of people insulting him, and they were at war, and the Prophet Muhammad was at war, and he was fighting and he was killing. But there are stories where if someone insulted him, he would put his sword down and say, "If I killed you now, it's because you insulted me and not because I'm protecting the Muslim people. So I'm not going to kill you now." And that in itself has created conversions to Islam. And so that is Islam recognizing the mimetic phenomenon of violence escalating because of personal insult and taking a step back and restraining it. So you could look at it as, oh, but he was justifying violence, so he's saying there's such a thing as good violence. Or you can look at the restrained aspect of it and say he recognized something that most soldiers do not, and if most soldiers acted the way he did, maybe there would be less killing. So you can look at it both ways, and I choose to look at it in a merciful way and take it from there. So.
Yeah, it's a really tough question for those of us involved in mimetic theory. I mean, we struggle with this a lot, you and I do. And even those really violent passages that everyone who wants to say, oh, look at Islam, it's just horribly violent. That from chapter 2 of the Quran where it says something like, kill the infidels wherever you find them. And they will just quote that, and then they won't quote the next part of the verse, which is, but if they ask you for peace, you must give them peace and trust God. They don't quote the last part of it. And since we're involved in the theory, I mean, we question that because, violence has a way of leveling out of control. You can't control violence. Violence controls you. But here is, I think, just war theory in Christianity. I think it's trying, as you say, to restrain things. And from a mimetic perspective, whether or not you can actually do that is a question. But that, I think, is another place where it has a lot in common with Christianity, especially in the just war tradition. That, of course, does not come from Jesus. It comes from Augustine. But I think that it is a genuine attempt to stop violence, and your ultimate aim is peace. If they ask you for peace, you must stop.
Yes.
Right away and trust God. That's my best answer to it, and I know from a medical theory perspective it's problematic, but that's the best case that I can make for it.
As far as Islam and violence, we also need to say that Islam says that to kill an innocent person is to kill all of humanity. Because of that, the concept of collateral damage is, Islam, according to the Quran, which is the book that Muslims believe to be God's immutable word, the immutable word of God. I won't say literal because that means you can take everything in the Quran at face value, and you can't. Muslims have a deeper understanding of that, and it is very important to understand the context in which each verse was revealed. But according to the immutable word of God, you cannot kill a non-combatant. And that is, I think that makes modern warfare impossible. And I think that there are Muslims who would agree with me on that. So.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's such a great point. Modern warfare is impossible because you cannot kill non-combatants from the Quran's view. That's a brilliant point. Let's go to Francis's question, and I can't answer this one. It's very specific. So if you feel like you can answer it, go ahead. Francis asks, can you tell us how we Christians look to American Muslims who don't really know us? And can you talk about commonalities and differences in worship? What it means, how it is done?
Okay. I can answer the second one more clearly than the first, but I think Francis's point with the first question, obviously I cannot say how we look to Muslims who don't know us. I can barely even say how we look to Muslims who do know us.
Right, yeah.
But I can say that we have to absolutely consider how we look to Muslims who don't know us. You know, we see, you know, if we see a media image of a Muslim shouting Allahu Akbar and waving an AK-47 over his head, we're going to say, oh, look how violent they are. But, you know, do we consider how these Muslims feel when they see YouTube videos of the army hymns to Jesus right before they, where are our armies today? They're mostly in Muslim countries, and they're mostly performing night raids on families in countries and flying drones, and you know, Muslims are bearing the brunt of our aggression right now. So we absolutely have to consider how we look to them, and we have to look inward at our own violence. So that is a point that we need to always consider. I can't answer how we look to Muslims, but, you know, how we look to me is pretty bad right now most of the time. So that, which is not to say that, you know, I know that soldiers go into the army with feelings of love and mercy and protection. And not only for the families back here, but, you know, we think that we're doing good for the people over there. So that's important. And I think there are a lot of soldiers who are welcome. But really, there's so much wrong going on too. And I think Muslims see that, especially if we demonize Muslims. I think that monetically they will demonize us back, or only show the parts of us that are ugly and unmerciful. So we need to consider that.
Yeah.
And the second question was about worship and
can you talk about commonalities and differences in worship, what it means, how it is done? I confess I've never been to an Islamic worship service, so I don't know. I wouldn't know how to answer that.
Okay, well, I have, and Muslim worship service consists of a lot of prayer and a sermon, a khutbah. The experience of praying with Muslims is unforgettable because your whole being is involved. It's very physical, and there's no concept of personal space. There's no concept of personal space. You are shoulder to shoulder with other Muslims of your gender, but it's just too crowded, and they just don't segregate in Mecca. So I think that's kind of amazing. But you know, I've prayed shoulder to shoulder with Muslim women many times, and so there's a lot of love and a lot of you know, just a very strong closeness. Citing a Muslim prayer right now because my hair is down. But maybe sometime if we do a follow-up conversation, I can put on hijab and recite something of the Quran so you can hear what it sounds like, because the sound and the movement goes together. It's very beautiful. And there's a very strong sense of solidarity, a very strong sense of sisterhood, I'll say, because I pray with women, and brotherhood for men, and common family, being united. We could get into we could get into mimetic theory with that too, with Muslims all around the world, because of the prayer time. You at least know that you're praying with the people in your time zone, probably at the same time if you follow the call to prayers exactly, and that's pretty awesome. And you're probably praying Fajr at the same time someone in China is praying Isha. You're probably praying the morning prayer at the same time somebody's praying the evening prayer, and there's a sense of connection all over the world, which is, I feel like it should be similar to what Christians feel praying the daily office, but let's be honest, Muslims are much more faithful about their daily prayers than Christians, than most Christians I know are about praying the daily office. So
yeah, what's the daily office? I don't even know. I looked at it. Well,
are you kidding? I don't know if you're kidding. But yeah, I think
So we've got 2 questions left, and of course there are so many questions. So I like your idea of doing follow-up conversations. But here's one from our friend Paul Nectarline. Paul says, for me, the insight that turns the Judeo-Christian tradition in the right direction is that God is typically on the side of the victim, the side of the socially other. Is there any analogous insight within the Islamic tradition? That's his first question. We'll tackle that one and then get to the second one.
Okay, well,
go ahead.
Go ahead. No, you go ahead.
No, well, I was just going to say that we've explored this a little bit with the Quran and Muhammad's insistence on caring for the socially other, for the weak, the poor, the marginalized. There's one section even in the Quran where it talks about if you are receiving an inheritance, which happened frequently in that culture. And the Quran says that as you are getting your inheritance, if anyone comes among you, anyone who is poor, weak, needy, a traveler, and then it says anyone who comes to you and is in need, you must give out of your inheritance to help supply the needs for anyone who comes to you and asks for help. I mean, this, I think, is the radical message that the Quran that God cares for the socially other, as Paul puts it. So I see huge analogous insights within the Islamic tradition of caring and loving for the socially other.
Absolutely. I want to recommend your series, Islam 101, on the Raven Foundation website, especially the video you do about the Jahiliyyah, which is the age of ignorance, because that's a starting point for me. For a long time, I was trying to think of a good starting point for entering Christian-Muslim dialogue because I didn't know where to begin, but that is a good beginning because when I think about what drew Muhammad into solitude when he first heard his first revelation, it was a sense of disenchantment with the injustice of the world around him. So I hear a knock on my door. That is my family returning.
Oh, goodness. Thank you, everybody, for watching this discussion that Lindsey and I had. If you have any comments or questions, Lindsey and I will be doing follow-up conversations. So just type your questions or comments in the comment box below. Thank you for the conversation, Lindsey.
Thank you so much, Adam, and thanks to everyone who's been listening.